Perspective. It's kind of what makes up everything. When we agree with somebody on what something is, it's because our perspectives, we share two different perspectives which, can agree on, like, say, a fact or something. And when you're talking about just how there's an infinite amount of perspectives that make something up, like your dog example, and taking a picture of a dog from every possible point in space to get all those different perspectives. That's like when we're giving our perspective, we're saying what something is. Like, we're saying what something is, we're saying what something's role in reality is. So it's kind of what constructs everything. It's what brings about the whole universe to us. It can be a perspective as far as our view on something, or it can even be our perspective just as far as the range of light we see or sound we hear. And just how we translate information that comes in into our brain and the images it gives us and experiences it gives us. So it just kind of makes up everything. Like, it's what makes up our reality. It's like when we were talking before about opposition creating reality, and how dualities, like we have these opening of dualities we have these opening of dualities in our universe, and that's basically the structure of our universe. And then on each one of those dualities, like if you think of those dualities as like a scale, somewhere on these dualities our perspective is. So its perspective is like the point that we are on all these scales of duality, but there's an infinite amount of them. So we're
it's like trying give a little visualization to what you were saying. Let's give a situation where you were invited to a party and you're trying to decide whether you want to go or not, and there's all these deciding factors in this scale, like you were talking about, these scales in which influence you whether you want to go to the party or not. There's some people that are going to be there that you don't really care for, so they're kind of down low on the scale. It's a disapproval. And then, but you also have some good people there too. You got some good friends, so that's another influence over on this scale. These people, they're making a different influence. And then, they got food there. You really like food, so that's really high up on that scale. But then you have to work tomorrow morning, so you got this other scale that's it's negative down there. So there's all these scales on how you can interpret and feel about something. And it's just like the scales of our temperature. If you walk outside, you've noticed the difference between hot and cold. There's just that.
There's a place on that scale of hot and cold where you feel like you are.
Yeah, exactly.
You walk outside and you're like, regardless of what the temperature is, it's if it's hot and you walk into somewhere cold, it's going to seem colder than it is, and vice versa. It's like when you get that experience of either being hot or cold, then you put yourself somewhere on a scale of thinking it's hot or cold. And like you basically do that with an infinite amount of things all the time. Like every decision you make and how you feel about everything, you're all on somewhere on a scale. And that's basically what your perspective is just the collective of all those scales that come together to give you like your ultimate encompassing perspective from your view as a person you are.
And these scales that we're talking about, they can be anything and everything that is sending information to your consciousness. Anything one of your senses is picking up is a scale that's active on how you're feeling at that moment, what you're experiencing. And it could be something as significant to an emotional encounter you had throughout the day, or something as insignificant as just a random house plant in your house, just affecting the environment in that way. But there's still all these scales, there's still having these scales that can affect how you feel and what you're experiencing. And you also have to think everything you know is what you've learned and experienced from birth, from your happenings in the happening. Everything you experience, you take in this experience and you give it those labels and structure so you can make sense of the world. How you know the world, how you view people, how you see situations out, your preference in music, your cars, everything has been your five senses taking in all this information out in the universe, and your experiences based off of this and how you feel about those experiences, building who you are. And with that being said, with all those factors influencing who you are, everybody is going to have a unique perspective of their own. And although people may be very similar, they're still on a much different wavelength usually. You're never going to have the exact same perspective as someone. There's always going to be another way to see something. You are just experiencing one little bit of the entirety. You're just one person in the universe. And think of all the cells that make up you, and all the atoms that make up those cells. Everything and everything. There's just so much going on.
Just to give an idea for the immensity of different possible perspectives, you can think of it as like every atom in the universe has a perspective on every other atom in the universe, and even subatomic particles and quarks and all of that it's somewhere in the universe in relation to everything else in the universe. So it has, even if it's not like a sentient thing, it's still somewhere in the universe in relation to everything else. So it still has perspective. You have to take like everything times everything, and that's basically the amount of perspectives you have, combined with a ever-expanding universe. And it's just infinite from there.
Just a really small scale. Just yourself and who you are. You have your own unique view and perspective of yourself. But then if you ask someone else who you are, they're going to give you another person. They see someone else than you see. And there's going to be some similarities, of course, because they're taking in information from you and what you put out into the universe. But you both are going to have just way different concepts of who you really are. And neither of them are wrong. Who they see you as is just as right as who you see yourself as. Maybe,
just a different
if
piece
not
of the same thing.
More, right?
Yeah.
Because they're the bystander and they don't have the ego in the way.
Yeah.
They're getting the straight information coming off of you. They're taking it in for themselves.
But even with like your perspective on you, you have the perspective as you, but the fact that you're friends with that other person or something is a perspective in its own. Like, you have the perspective of you, and part of you that's you is the fact that you have this person as your friend. So even just them being around to be able to give you another perspective is an aspect of your perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like,
yeah.
You know, like I could be me, and like if I didn't know you, then I would have the perspective of somebody that didn't know you. But I do. So that's, just an aspect that affects my perspective.
Yeah.
Another important thing to realize about, or an important thing about thinking about it as your perspective being a point on a scale, is that it makes you realize that opposites are really just two parts of the same thing. So, like, there's a lot of times people want to change something about themselves, but they just feel like it's too hard, or it's too impossible, or I'm this way, so that means I can't be that way. But when you look at it as, so just to make it simple, we'll say happy and sad. Like, you're like, oh, I'm a sad person, I'm a depressed person, so that means I can't be happy. And if you look at them as opposites, then yeah, it makes sense. Like, if you're on this planet of sadness and this planet of happiness is over here, then oh, you're fucked. But if you look at it as a scale, and more like, there's happiness, this planet of happiness here and this planet of depression here, but it's a scale, so there's like a bridge between it, and you're somewhere on that scale, like you're somewhere on that bridge between the two, then you're able to move about that scale between the two. And that comes with realizing that it's just two parts of the same thing instead of two completely separate things. Not thinking of it like you have either one or the other. It's both one thing. You have a scale of happy sadness, or a scale of happy sad, and you're just somewhere on that scale. And it just gives you a visualization and a sense that you can move about that between them. You can change your perspective on, anything, not just your feelings, but just any of these scales that you have, you can move about them. And then you can use that you can think about the person that, you want to be in the future, and think about where they are on each of those scales, and then work to move yourself in that direction in whichever aspects you want to change about yourself. So where it's important to be mindful and practice different aspects of mindfulness too, because it can take you out of that narrow perspective that you have, and you can see things from a less unique, less specific, narrower view. And if you can broaden your perspective to see that specific perspective you have is just one part of a small system, and then you can broaden your perspective to see how that works in a bigger system, and so on. You're just like getting into a situation that's not favorable to you, and you can either be pissed about it and stress yourself over it, or you can realize that that's just one part in a bunch of going ons, and like you don't know if it's good or bad because you don't know what else it's affecting. You don't know, like, you're driving and you get a flat tire or something that could have saved you from, getting into an accident a mile down the road or something like that. And when you're able to broaden your perspective, it just makes things make more sense, and it makes things, you realize why things are just happenings, and it's not necessarily something that's happening to you. It's just happening.
Yeah, there's never any wrong in the universe. It's literally just the universe being the universe.
It also allows you to broaden your perspective. That is, it helps for you to put yourself in other people's perspectives too, or at least to an extent, which can make it maybe other people that you don't like, or just strangers that you run into that you don't have a good encounter with. If you can put yourself in their perspective, or even, you don't even have to put yourself in their perspective, but if you can take yourself out of your perspective and just realize that there's other perspectives.
Yeah, I like to give a lot of false perspectives. Like, I just like to put people in probably worse situations than what they are, just to give the realization, like, well, there really could be something behind all this, why they're in a horrible mood.
Yeah, like
maybe
some
a close
reason to give them the
relative
benefit of the
passed
doubt.
away. Maybe they got that flat tire.
Yeah.
There's always something going on, and maybe they are just ignorant, but you can still take that in your perspective and say, wow, I don't want to be like that.
Yeah.
Just looking at it like that is already broadening your perspective. And it's a lot of just staying on top. And when you have those moments and you start realizing that you have this perspective going on and everybody else has their own perspective, when you start reminding yourself this enough, you start just getting the ability to let things go easier. It's a lot less stressful. You can just really take yourself out of that situation and put yourself in that third person perspective, like we always talk about. Just put yourself above the situation, really look down on it to see what's going on. And also, on top of this, you start seeing the person you think you are and the person that has this perspective, or your ego, in other words. And once you can identify this ego, you can really mold yourself and make all those changes a lot easier, because you know you're the trickster. You're the one tricking yourself into, I'm sad and I can't be happy, or I'm mad at this person, I'll never forgive them. this is a bad day because of my flat tire. When really, that's just that perspective your ego's creating. You could feel completely different about all those situations if you just took the time to think about it in a different way.
It's like if you're watching waves on the ocean and like you wouldn't sit there and judge the waves as just somebody sitting on the beach watching the waves. You wouldn't be like, oh, that's a better wave than that one. That wave's not good enough. That wave should be more this or less that. Unless you're like a surfer, and then you have a different perspective. So from the perspective of a surfer, you have a reason to think like, oh, this wave's better than that one. This one should be bigger. This one, whatever. And you can think of that, kind of use that analogy for situations you run into in life that, like you were saying, you run into a situation, you want to be upset about it, but you're the only one making yourself upset about it because you're taking that more narrow perspective of somebody who is like offended by that situation for whatever reason. And if there's no reason for you to take that perspective, then you don't have to put yourself there. Like, you can take yourself out of that perspective and put yourself in a different one. That's the perspective of somebody who isn't offended or isn't troubled by whatever situation they found themselves in. And generally that can just be a slightly broader perspective.
And a good way to also think about trying to just force yourself to think about things in a different way is your ego is built, like I was saying, your ego is built from your past experiences and all of the opinions you have and how your ego thinks and all your feelings towards whatever it may be. Once it's a past experience, but there will never be that same experience. There's always going to be a new experience to happen. Although it may be similar, and that's what your ego, your consciousness is referring to, doesn't mean it's going to be the same. It's just staying wary because maybe you just didn't like that situation before and it didn't play out how you wanted it to. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be bad when similar occurrences happen. There's always going to be a new experience to be had, and it's just you don't know what's going to come of what again.
Using old perspectives for new situations. Instead of being there in the perspective that's currently going on. Like you said, if it's a situation that's similar to something that happened before that, you weren't happy about, then as soon as you see enough triggers a similarity between the two situations, then you just like how our brain fills stuff in, fills in information that we take in, it's going to kind of fill in that perspective and connect the dots between the two situations without really being there and being present and looking at the current situation.
It's just the mind doing mind stuff.
Yeah.
It's how your body's operating. It's not going to stop, but you can step in and have that influence upon yourself and just view yourself in that because your mind has the capability. It's just like breathing. You can let it happen and just breathe on its own. Let your body breathe on its own, or you can really actually just take control of your breathing. And it's the same with your mind. It's just a happening. Your mind's going to keep chattering because think of all your brain's in charge of so much, it just can't stop. And you're constantly taking in information, so your consciousness is just in this constant chatter and just taking all this information and comparing it and making ideas of it and what have you, just interpreting all this information in whatever way it may be. And you can just let the clouds float by and do their thing, or you can take charge and direct the clouds where you want them to go. You can get carried away by the clouds, or you can watch the clouds.